On this episode of Skeptico, Alex talks with famous near-death experience researcher Dr. Raymond Moody about his recent memoir, Paranormal.
Are we limited just by a system of logic, or is there in some way we're fundamentally unable to know certain things in this existence that we're in?
What a wonderful distinction. As to the second part of your question, whether there is some kind of unknowability in the world that we are just constitutionally unable to apprehend certain things. Obviously, I don't know. By definition, you wouldn't be able to know that.
Right.
But I think that the first part of your question was kind of, is our logic limiting us in some fundamental way? And I think it is, Alex. And I think just from our two conversations together, I think I can prove it to you. What I can show is that these misconceptions create a kind of collective cognitive deficit in people that is hidden because everybody has it, right? If everybody has it, there's no way that people have us detecting it. And the way that this manifests itself is that when people hear a sentence like, there is life after death, and unthinkingly, they look at that, they treat that just like a literal, meaningful, true or false proposition, right? And so they try to process it by the rules of Aristotelian logic. Their minds go berserk.
Stay with us for Skeptico.
Welcome to Skeptico, where we explore controversial science with leading researchers, thinkers, and their critics. I'm your host, Alex Tsakiris, and on this episode, I speak with Dr. Raymond Moody. Dr. Moody, of course, is one of the best-known near-death experience researchers and the person who pioneered the field and coined the term near-death experience. It's always a great pleasure to talk to Dr. Moody, and it's always a bit of a challenge. He always seems a bit of an enigma, a bit hard to pin down or maybe hard to interpret at times, but it's certainly a pleasure to talk to him, and there are conversations that always leave me thinking for days afterwards. Who can ask for more than that? Here's my interview with Dr. Raymond Moody. Today, we welcome Dr. Raymond Moody to Skeptico. In 1975, psychiatrist and professor of philosophy Dr. Raymond Moody published Life After Life and coined the term near-death experience. And I guess it's fair to say the world changed a little bit. I don't think that's an exaggeration. It's hard to measure the full impact of Dr. Moody's work on medicine, on science, religion, and our culture as a whole, but it's certainly clear that this groundbreaking research has continued to challenge our understanding of the deepest questions that we all have that keep us up at 2 o'clock in the morning. Dr. Moody, it's a great pleasure to have you on Skeptico. Thanks so much for joining me.
Well, I'm just so happy to be with you today, Alex. This is, I can already tell this is going to be fun. Thank you.
I feel quite fortunate to be able to interview you for a second time here, and as particularly on this book. You've written a memoir titled Paranormal, My Life in Pursuit of the Afterlife. And I think it's quite an amazing and brave undertaking that you've kind of taken us through here in this journey. And that was really, I guess, the first question that I had for you, Dr. Moody. Clearly you've been somebody who's been in the public eye for a long time. You've seen it, done it, every TV show you can imagine, every radio show. You've done all that. But this had to be something a little bit different. What has it been like for being that open and that out there in terms of telling people about your whole life?
Well, something, Alex, I'll tell you the truth. As you know, I'm a psychiatrist, and not only that, I was a forensic psychiatrist for a while in a maximum security unit for the criminally insane. And I've lived in a lot of different set of circumstances and so on, and, what I've really kind of come to see is that everybody has about the same secrets. Plus, secret keeping is an intrinsically dysphoric experience. And, I've been through some rough spots. I never did think about writing my memoirs. I was thinking, what a bore, I had a PhD in philosophy when I was 24 years old. And that shows you what a boring person I am. And seriously, I'm talking straight here because from my age of 67, I could realize there's something terribly wrong about somebody who would have their PhD when they were in philosophy when they were 24.
Really, because I really kind of read that differently in reading about your childhood and your upbringing, which I all found very fascinating and kind of put together this amazing mosaic that it's remarkable how people's lives do seem to fit together for a purpose. But, certainly you were a smart kid. That's one of the things that came through. And that, I think it speaks out to other people, other kids who maybe experience that they're excelling in all these ways that our society says you're supposed to excel. And in other ways, it's really kind of isolating them. What do you think about that? What did that?
That's exactly how it was. And as I look back, Alex, I'm not sure. Were people isolating me, or was I isolating myself? In the sense that, I have accepted a few years ago this diagnosis I was given 20 years ago, but it took me a long time to sort of see that it's right, is of Asperger's syndrome. And I know from my reading on that I really do fit that social interactions have never been my forte. I remember when I was in the fourth grade, my mom and dad found out that I had been slipping in some subjects in school, but when they inquired into the reason, it was that I had been reading my father's physics textbook from college and taking notes and so on. And I always have followed what drives my curiosity. I can't not do it. Whether it's something that, society says we shouldn't investigate, or well, it's just whatever draws my curiosity. But another thing is, in my profession, the hard thing for me is I don't want to get mixed up with parapsychologists, because I think that is just an utter pseudoscience. For somebody to say in the year, 2012, that we can get scientific evidence of life after death, for example, through these, that almost is academic misconduct, in my opinion. Not all problems are going to be resolvable by science, and I think, especially with some issue like life after death, that is not yet a scientific question. But that doesn't mean we can't investigate it. I think that philosophy is still it's a discipline that's very important, even though we've kind of brushed it aside in the 21st century.
Well, Dr. Moody, you're going to have to back up for a minute, because I think one of the interesting threads that weaves through this book and maybe your life is this. You like to play these edges, and you play them really well, and you like to kind of provoke people a little bit, but I think that's good. But one of the edges is this kind of paradox you draw between a philosophical approach, but then you also have this scientific bent, this medical bent. Maybe you need to back up and tell people why you think that philosophical approach is necessary, or how it gets at these questions that can't get a straight yes or no, this way, that way answer. Why does that intrigue you so much?
Perfect. Well, see, that's what has most interested me in my life, and things I'm curious about, is the big questions that seem really pressing in a way, that just occur to you naturally. For example, like, what size and shape is this thing that we're in called the universe? Well, what you tend to do in your mind is you think about both possibilities. One is, well, does it end in a wall? So your mind goes out to the wall, but then suddenly you think, oh my goodness, doesn't there have to be something on the other side of a wall? So that route seems unintelligible, but similarly, if you think of what seems to be the other possible route, that it goes on and on and on forever, then that's unintelligible too. So what really interests me are big questions that are unintelligible, and that is what philosophy is all about. All the big questions originated as philosophical questions, and then over the centuries, following the ancient Greeks, as people began to figure out ways to actually settle these questions, as opposed to just sort of think about them and reason about them. And Galileo, for example, the standard position was that a heavier object will fall down faster than a lighter one. And so Galileo just built some inclined planes and rolled balls of various weights down, and anybody who just looked could see that they went down at the same speed. And so what I'm talking about is a question like life after death. The question is not really how can we set up some experiment to prove it, which is the kind of parapsychological point of view, but what in the name of God does it mean? I mean, there's no clear concept there, see.
Well, no, you've been playing around for a number of years with this idea that we need a new system of logic. But, I can never wrap my arms around what you mean by that. Can you maybe fill us in? Where are you driving towards with that idea that we need?
All right. Well, then, I would be happy to send you a complimentary copy of my manuscript if you would care to look at it and comment. But then to get to your question about what it's all about, I think that I have worked out the logic of unintelligibility, Alex. I really do. You and I know that logic as we have it is a binary code, right? True or false. And that it's predicated on propositions of literal meaning. And that has a historical development. It started about 550 BC roughly, and went through the next 100+ years until Aristotle codified pretty much the logic we have. But in that process, something got left out, and primarily because of Aristotle's kind of severely obsessional, as it apparently was, personality. Because Plato, for example, had been working. Plato understood the true-false dichotomy. As a matter of fact, he's the one who finally worked it out. And the idea that to search for knowledge, we reside in the literal domain of language with meaningful propositions. But Plato also realized that there was a third factor, namely unintelligibility or nonsense. And so what I have done, Alex, and I'm confident in saying this because my colleagues have read this and say I've done it, is that I've worked out the logic of nonsense. And therefore, since the sentence like there is life after death is nonsense,
right?
Because it's a self-contradiction.
Well, it's funny, isn't the title of your most famous book, Life After Life, is an example? Yes. I mean, I almost feel like you're kind of playing with us in a way there in this, pointing out that there's this not in a I don't mean it in a mean way or that, but just that you're playing with the words, you're playing with the way that we use them in a way that kind of points out the embedded contradiction, and you can't have life after life. It's yeah, exactly. And you see, to me, the question is important, and because it is important, then what we are obligated to do is to apply the strictest
reasoning we can to it. I mean, it's not going to make people feel good for a few moments to hear the charismatic speaker, assure them that this is evidence of life after death, but you don't carry that with you. It's the doubts resurface of its self-deception. So this is, I think, one of the most important questions of existence, and therefore it deserves real rigor in thinking it through.
I wonder, though, is it the rigor and the logic that we're missing, or is there something fundamental to our experience in this body, in this world, that prevents us from maybe understanding things differently? And I say that not to be too abstract, but that seems to be part of the message that we get back from the stories that you've collected and other near-death experience researchers have, as well as, from a variety of spiritual experiences that you also have experience with. People come back and say, I had a knowing that I'm unable to really bring back and internalize. Are we limited just by a system of logic, or is there in some way we're fundamentally unable to know certain things in this existence that we're in?
What a wonderful distinction. And as to the second part of your question, whether there is some kind of unknowability in the world that we are just constitutionally unable to apprehend certain things. Obviously, I don't know. By definition, you wouldn't be able to know that.
Right.
But I think that the first part of your question was kind of, is our logic limiting us in some fundamental way? And I think it is, Alex. And I think just from our two conversations together, I think I can prove it to you.
That'd be real interesting. I'd love for you to take a few minutes and dig into this, because it's really played on my mind of what you're really getting at here. So,
all right, first of all, nonsense, that word is a pejorative term. And in not just the United States, but I've traveled over a lot of the world in the many decades I've been working on this, my interest in logic and philosophy of language. But there seems to be this very widespread opinion of people that there are four total misconceptions about what nonsense is. First of all, most people think that nonsense is something purely bad and undesirable, like it's inherently bad, necessarily a negative quantity. Secondly, that it's associated somehow with non-existence and non-being and chaos. This is a very common image, as I've gathered over 40 years of experience with this, that people come up when they come up with thinking about nonsense. Then the third is that people confuse nonsense with falsehood. They think nonsense is the same as falsehood, except maybe like with an exclamation point or something. And fourthly, that nonsense is something inherently unfathomable and beyond logic and reason. And those opinions are maintained, Alex, with an almost visceral reflex by people. You can just see them cringe when you tell them that you're investigating the subject of nonsense, for example. Well, anyway, therefore what I can show is that these misconceptions create a kind of collective cognitive deficit in people that is hidden because everybody has it, right? If everybody has it, there's no way that people have of detecting it. And the way that this manifests itself is, one way, is that when people hear a sentence like, there is life after death, and unthinkingly, they look at that, they treat that just like a literal, meaningful, true or false proposition, right? And so they try to process it by the rules of Aristotelian logic. Their minds go berserk, as you and I have seen many times. Probably know many people whose minds have gone berserk over this the topic. And now, what I do is I start with a simple dictionary definition to correct all this. I start with a simple dictionary definition of nonsense. Nonsense is language that is unintelligible due to lack of meaning. Then I set up the simple criterion for, disputed examples. For example, what if one person says, oh, it's nonsense, and some other person says, no, it makes perfect sense to me. So the way but you want to choose only bona fide examples to set up the theory. And the way I do it is I distinguish between deliberate nonsense, a la Lewis Carroll and Dr. Seuss and Shel Silverstein and Edward Lear and so on, and involuntary nonsense when, for example, a patient is delirious and talking out of their heads, or schizophrenic people who use neologisms, made up meaningless words, or people who are under great stress, for example, even if they're not injured, it will sometimes make them talk nonsense. And so our people who are intoxicated with mercury, for example, or ethylene, and so on and so on and so on. And so by choosing only examples of nonsense from the deliberate side, you remove the problem of disputed examples, but also then you might say, well, then it's only half the theory of nonsense, because what about the involuntary nonsense? Well, one of the amazing things I've discovered, Alex, is that when people talk nonsense involuntarily, like when they're stressed or psychotic or delirious, the nonsense they talk has exactly the same patterns as we can find in the writings of nonsense writers. So now, once you get a sort of collection of nonsense writings, you quickly see there's all kinds of different patterns and types. Well, in my work, I've discovered over 70 different types of nonsense. For example, 'twas brilliant the slithy toves did Gyron Gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the baragoves, and the mom wrath outgrabe. That's obviously one type of nonsense, but listen to this one. This is a wholly different type. Holiness breeds the vestigial lipstick of spontaneity. Or a third one, I'm not an actor, but I played one on television. Or that cannibal we just ate was the last one around these parts. Those self-contradictions. So I've identified over 70 different types. And what it appears is that each of these different types of nonsense apparently stimulates different type parts of the brain, or that each one is distinguished by its own cognitive effects and so on. And then I've just made these amazing discoveries about how all kinds of wild psychological effects with nonsense. And so with this, we have a very powerful tool for resolving a kind of situation that crops up just constantly. I'm sure you see it if you keep up with the science literature. I mean, there's always the debate about whether some new idea is or is not nonsense, right? And these can be very big. I mean, I heard this is I keep a running tally of these from the science journals, and it's constant. And so thus far we've had no way of resolving these disputes, but now we do, because if somebody has lapsed into nonsense involuntarily, it can match, you see, one of the patterns of deliberate nonsense, and so that's the way of settling the disputes.
I hear you, and that's interesting. I'm still not totally making the connection, though, between the logical component of it. So I understand there's deliberate nonsense and there's just, we lapse into
Okay, yes. I mean, I don't know if you studied philosophy, but you know how in philosophy they'll talk about the logic of a concept or something. So I'm talking here in that sense, in terms of a set of rational principles that you can use to further inquiry on certain questions that have been left unresolved. And one of these is the question of life after death. I can use that as a sample problem, for example, because, for example, people, for example, who have these near-death experiences. Let me go back, Alex, and at this point you really may conclude that I flipped off the deep end, but let me go back in time to the presidency of Abraham Lincoln, okay? And Lincoln was at a solemn state ceremony. I read this in Carl Sandburg's biography when I was a kid, but I don't remember what the ceremony was about. But his part in the ceremony called for him to mount a horse and to lead the horse a procession away from the scene. And when he did, this is very solemn, he climbed up on the horse, but the horse got its own back hoof caught in the stirrup and was bouncing around, and the crowd was sort of shocked into silence by seeing Mr. Lincoln in this, just gosh-awful predicament, and everybody's kind of embarrassed, So Lincoln just very calmly looked down at the horse, and he said, "Well, if you're getting on, I'm getting off." Now, that's totally nonsensical, right? And yet, you've got to admit, it nonetheless brings up a very vivid image of motion in your mind. Okay. Now, if we had more time, I could read you some longer poems written by nonsense poets that capture this same effect. That since we're all familiar with the format of a travel narrative, we know from childhood how it's laid out and what you're supposed to do, you see. It's possible, therefore, to lay down a layer of nonsense over the framework of a travel narrative, and when you do, it gives you the mental effect of motion, even when no such motion is possible except into words. Now, how does this relate, for example, to the investigation of near-death experiences? Well, what people tell us who have near-death experiences is that, number one, this experience did not take place in time. A wonderful woman once said to me, Raymond, you could say that my experience took 10,000 years, or you could say that it took 1 second, and it wouldn't matter which way you said it. So that's how people talk, that this is a timeless experience. They also tell us that it's not in space, and that there are no words for it. And yet when they do relate it, this is how they relate it. They say, I got out of my body. I went through a tunnel into a light. I met my deceased relatives. I saw my life pass in review. I returned to my body and came back to life. That's a travel narrative.
Right, and I see where you're going. Both those statements are nonsensical inside of our logic, inside of our language. But let me tie it back to, I want you to stay right on that point, but let me tie it back to a story that you paint in the book, Paranormal, about your encounter with Elisabeth Kubler-Ross, because here it was, just as you describe it in the book, the philosopher you encountering the researcher and the advocate a person of medicine, but also an advocate, and she says to you, Raymond, what are you talking about? How can you draw this distinction that you aren't convinced that this is scientific evidence of life after death? And she uses the analogy that I think was really a good one too, that sticks in my mind. It is more kind of grounded where I'm at. She said, when the first European explorers went over and discovered North America, well, the first one can come back and give you a story and you can say, well, that's one guy. But when 2, 3, 4, 5, when 100 people come back and we look at those stories and we start tying them together, don't we overcome those barriers that we have in logic or language?
Well, that is a very good point. That is a good point, especially, Alex, since in recent months, do you know about the case of Eben Alexander III?
Yes, we've actually interviewed him on the show. He's a very interesting guy, right?
Yes. Now, I don't know about you, but it's very hard to figure out what language to bring to a situation like that.
I'm a speck on a butterfly. I mean, this is poetry. This is beyond it's the scientific. I understand what you mean. Yeah.
Well, yes, and also, I mean, I'm talking here about the fact that the severity of his medical condition, from my understanding, pretty much rules out that he could have been conscious during that period, by what we understand of the brain right now, and also that he met a sister he didn't know he had. I mean, this is getting very hard to dance your way out of. Well, and then I'm just going to tell you this next thing, because this has just happened a few days ago. I found out about this thing, and incidentally, I live in Choccolocca, Alabama, and all my neighbors, they know I write books and all and what it's about, but we don't talk about, we talk about community things, and I'm not the person who talks about near-death experiences all the time, but I was so amazed by this one that I told my friend Philip up at the Faulkner's filling station about this, and he said that it made the hairs on his arms stand up. And Philip is a very grounded person, and so basically, and I can't be forthcoming on this one right now in terms of the details. I mean, I don't have permission from the parties involved, but this one case I knew of already is a man who, I mean, it's just absolutely impossible by medicine to comprehend that this guy lived, and just in this horrific situation, lost his wife and kids as well, and yet, just lived through this past all odds. But he was basically been doing some reflecting about it, and so he went to the surgeon who had fixed him up, and he talked to his surgeon about the situation, and the surgeon kind of said, well, I've never told anybody this, but then he went on to tell this man that he knew that the man was going to live, because when he was operating, the room, quote, the room opened up into another dimension, and he saw and talked with the wife of this guy he was working on, who had been killed in the accident. And you see, things like this are just getting very... I mean, I am a nominalist in the sense that, you've got to... I think always the rule is... the Occam rule kind of gets misstated, really, but... there does come a point where, as much as you want to simplify, that you begin to feel kind of intellectually dishonest. see, by putting some prosaic explanation to these things. This is just so gosh awful beyond that you don't know what to say about it, really.
You know, it's amazing to me that 35 years after your book, we're still taking seriously people like Dr. Samparnia, who I'm sure is a hardworking, I'm sure he's an extremely intelligent guy, but putting pictures, well-meaning, but really? We're going to put pictures above the bed and see? What are we trying to do here 35 years on? How much human experience do we have to deny?
Yeah, about that one in particular, in connection with that study, was that this could possibly prove life after death. And to me, that was astonishing to read. And, because I thought Plato pretty much put the kibosh on that one 2,300 years ago when he pointed out that even if you could prove that something leaves the body, it doesn't mean that it would continue to exist after the demolishment of the body.
The other thing I hear you saying is that, one, if we look at the narratives, and then two, if we take those narratives and we deconstruct them in the way that you're talking about, we get into nonsense. We get into time that no longer fits in our understanding of time. We get into relationships, the way we relate to the world in a way that no longer fits with our things. So we're kind of way out there. As soon as we take that step, it's a long way down, and there's really no way back.
Well, or it's a long way forward, because you see, I think that precisely what we need is to show conclusively that the notion of life after death is nonsense, and to show exactly what kind of nonsense it is. Because if you look at the history of rational inquiry, we've never really been deterred before by things being nonsensical. For example, when Galileo, looked at the moon and said, "Oh, a big rock," and Jupiter, and oh my God, it's got satellites going around it, not around the Earth, and then the Milky Way, oh my God, it's myriads of little teeny stars that have got to be much further away than any crystal sphere. Well, then he got to saying, well, okay, what the better idea is that the Earth, along with other planets, goes around the sun. And see, when people first heard that, they didn't object that it was false. Mm-hmm. What they objected was that it was unintelligible.
Mm-hmm. It was nonsense.
Yeah, because, you see, what Galileo is saying is that the Earth is one of the heavenly bodies like Venus and Mars and Jupiter, but that can't be because the Earth is down here. So you see, we can't be deterred in accepting something just because it's unintelligible. And that's kind of what I do in this, this kind of logic, is you can work out ways to push the question forward even when it's unintelligible.
Interesting. That's an interesting way to put it. Let me put out a very kind of prosaic question, but I have to do it because I think I know your answer, and I love your answer, and I want to get it. But Dr. Moody, do you believe in God?
No, I absolutely do not. And let me explain why. Usually the way that question is asked, do you believe that God exists? And what I want to point out is that usually the emphasis on the word exist. I am fully well aware that any belief that I, Raymond Moody, could formulate about God would be off base. So what I say is I have a relationship with God. And if that sounds evasive, so be it, because this is exactly how the way I look at it. I really am a Pyrrhonist skeptic, Alex, as you may be able to figure out. Mm-hmm. In the sense that, to me, it's a personal injury and insult to have to draw a conclusion about anything. It drives my wife crazy. and all my friends. But, I'm hardly ever exactly wrong. Hume said that the strongest position is always the negative.
You said a really interesting word. You have a relationship. Relationship, I think, is such a key part because it crops up in this work that you've done. You have a relationship with your past lives. You have these near-death experiencers have a relationship with that encounter. What does this mean when you say, I can't know, or I can't know God by definition, but I can have a relationship? Again, it gets back to this holes in our logic. How can we have a relationship that goes beyond this logic and knowing scientific part?
I have no idea. I really don't know how to rationalize it, but, it's just a personal presence. That's all I can say. Call me mystic, in a way, but maybe it is a mystical relationship, although it's certainly nothing like, I don't do any of the chant, just nothing. It's just, this is a personal relationship that comes through under certain circumstances, and I live with it.
But yet this is that edge that we have to walk. It's both the personal edge that we have to walk. It's also the professional edge that we have to walk. Tell me a little bit about Elisabeth Kubler-Ross, though, and then about this thing of flying too close to the fire, because it's not just her. This comes up over and over again. That
I'm glad you said not just her. And because, Alex, that gives me a good inroad. I think you will. My guess is that you will probably at least see what I'm getting at here in this, even if you don't agree with it. And that is that I think that I am probably the very best possible investigator to these kinds of things, like near-death experiences and all like that, because there's something very, I think, deep-seated in me that makes it really impossible for me to come to an opinion on it. And when I look at the people who are, the kind of acknowledged or anointed experts in the paranormal, what I think attracts people like that to it is the narrative interest. These are, let's face it, absolutely riveting stories. I've heard thousands of near-death experiences, and I can't wait to hear the next one. This much I acknowledge. Let's just make this the given, that these are fascinating stories. And I think that a certain kind of person who is drawn to this, and that their interest is totally based on the narratives, I think that the same tendency of mind that draws them to it also pretty much precludes that they can think rationally about it. Mm-hmm. And whereas the person who is a clear-headed analytical thinker would see very clearly that some of these claims of parapsychology and so on are just not even true or false, but just, meaningless, really.
I have a lot of empathy for the parapsychologists because I think a lot of their drive is reactionary because the materialists are just bonkers. I have interviewed on this show literally some of the world's leading neurosurgeons, and you just confront them with basic data, basic physics, basic neurology, like you were saying. Simple stuff about how can a brain that we know medically is severely compromised in all these different situations, how can we have, and then talk about nonsense. They go into a different kind of nonsense.
Yes, Alex, they do. And you're just absolutely right. And not only that, to me, it's just ridiculous for a person with a medical degree to call themselves a scientist. Huh. You can call yourself a scientist if you get your PhD in chemistry or physiology or physics or geology, but not if, an MD is a professional degree. It doesn't make you a scientist. But
Sure.
many people who have that degree tend to, they think that it qualifies them. And professors in medical schools who are real scientists have this constant difficulty with that. These clinicians who haven't been trained in the scientific method do these studies, and they just make obvious errors. So,
Dr. Moody, it's been wonderful having you on.
Tell
us
pleasure.
a little. It's been a great pleasure. It just sends us in so many different directions and gets my mind spinning, and I love that. Drives me forward. Tell us about some of the projects you're working on now and some of the things that you're up to.
Well, over the course of my teaching career, I developed an incredible method for teaching students the figures of speech, which is something necessary for any kid who studies literature. Has got to have a course in that. And I've developed this amazing system that makes it real easy for people. Of course, it's 40 years in development. I'm getting ready to publish that one, and I am now teaching a course over the internet.
Wow!
And it's about a 10-part course, and you can find out about it through Raymond NDE. Is the email address, RaymondNDE at AOL.com.
Oh, at AOL.com. So the email is RaymondNDE at AOL.com. Someone can send you an email and you'll send them information about it?
Absolutely. I'll send it right to the producer who's doing this, and it's already in... we've gotten wonderful comments from it, which is
What's
really
the
nice.
title of the course? What's the basic idea?
Something is, Alex, it's entitled A New Way of Thinking. And
Wow.
It's not just to talk about life after death. It's to absolutely reformat the mind for thinking rationally about big questions that heretofore have eluded reason.
Fantastic. Well, I'm signing up. If no one else,
Right.
you have one subscriber right here. I'm going to sign up for that. So that's wonderful. And books coming out. Any books coming out soon?
No, my new book, which you were kind enough to mention, The Paranormal. I'm having a lot of fun with that now, because that one is, as I said, it's not something I would normally do, write about myself, but they asked me to do it, and then it got to be like an exercise in studying myself, and I thought, it's been years and years since I thought about myself, and I realized I'm a pretty weird character, actually.
I don't know about that, but you're certainly an interesting character and make a very fast-reading, fast-paced book with so many little turns and twists, and anyone who's kept up to date on the real culture change that we've gone through from your research is going to be fascinated by the backstories, the numerous backstories that are found in the book. So once again, Dr. Moody, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Alex, and send me your address to that email address, and I'll get you a copy of my manuscript, and if you have time to read it, I greatly appreciate your comments.
I'll look forward to it. Thanks again to Dr. Raymond Moody for joining me today on Skeptiko. If you'd like more information about this show or any of our previous shows, please visit the Skeptiko website. It's at SKEPTIKO. Don't forget the K there. And there you'll find links to all our previous shows, an email and Facebook link to me, and all sorts of other good stuff. Well, there's any number of topics that we could pursue on the forum about this show. There's some questions that were left unanswered, really because Dr. Moody didn't choose to answer them or went off in a different direction, which is certainly his prerogative. I mean, it's interesting to hear where he takes things, but I did feel a little bit like I wish I could have pinned him down on a couple of areas or explored further what he's really driving at, particularly with some of his criticism of parapsychology and near-death experience research. But maybe we'll just have to leave those for another interview. Nonetheless, it was a very interesting dialogue, and I hope you have some thoughts and questions about it that you would like to share with us on the forum. Well, that's going to do it for this episode. I have several interesting shows coming up. Please stick with me for all of that. Please continue to write and blog about Skeptiko. Tell your friends about Skeptiko. Let's grow our small community here of interested inquirers about life and science's biggest and deepest questions. Take care. Bye for now.